They were not hidden deep in the wilderness. They were not buried on battlefields or prison grounds. They were beneath a home where children once played, beneath a porch repaired too many times, beneath soil that had been turned, packed down, and turned again. No markers, no records, no names. For decades, people lived above the dead, ate meals, slept through storms, celebrated birthdays, never asking why the ground never settled the same way twice. And when the earth finally broke its silence, it raised a question no one wanted to answer. Who was buried here, and why did no one come looking for them? For most of its existence, the property was not remarkable. It did not appear in newspapers. It was not associated with a crime. No missing persons reports pointed toward it. County ledgers listed nothing unusual. Death certificates told partial stories, if they existed at all. Neighbors remembered a family that kept to themselves, quiet, unassuming, present, but never involved. The home stood through decades of change. Roads were paved, farms were sold, generations came and went, but the land stayed quiet. No one asked how many people had lived there. No one counted how many left. No one noticed when certain names stopped appearing entirely. Silence did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. A missed report here, an unexplained absence there, and slowly a history formed without witnesses. The house sat several miles from the nearest town, at the end of a narrow road that bent away from traffic and sound. Trees crowded the property line, their roots breaking through old fencing, their shadows stretching across the yard like long fingers. The structure itself was plain: wooden siding, a low porch, a roof repaired with mismatched shingles from different decades. Nothing about it demanded attention, and that was its greatest protection. The soil around the home was dark and heavy, clay-rich, difficult to dig in without leaving scars. Yet certain areas of the yard had been turned again and again. Garden plots that never produced, ground that sank slightly after heavy rain. From the road, it looked peaceful. From above, it looked undisturbed. But land remembers pressure. It remembers weight, and it remembers when something is placed where it does not belong. The family arrived quietly. No grand purchase, no announcement, just a transfer of land recorded in county books, signed in careful handwriting, witnessed by names that no longer exist in living memory. They were not wealthy. They were not desperate. They lived simply, too simply. Children were rarely seen beyond the property line. School records were inconsistent. Doctors' visits were uncommon. The family handled matters internally. Neighbors noticed patterns. Children who appeared for a few years, then disappeared. Relatives who visited briefly, then never returned. Questions were not asked directly. Rural communities survive on restraint. You learn who does not welcome curiosity, and you learn to look away. It began as discipline. At least, that is how it was described when mentioned at all. Strict routines, controlled movement, isolation presented as protection. But isolation hardens into something else when left unchecked. Rooms were repurposed, doors reinforced, windows sealed or covered. The house changed without explanation. Inside, fear became structural. Rules multiplied. Punishments escalated. And when people broke, when bodies failed, the family did not seek help. They solved problems the only way they believed possible. Quietly. Permanently. No funerals. No graves marked with stone. Just earth pressed back into place. The truth did not surface because someone went looking for it. It surfaced because the house was sold. New owners noticed something wrong with the yard. Soil that shifted, areas where grass refused to grow. An excavation began for a routine repair, a trench, a foundation check. The shovel struck something solid, not rock, not debris, bone. Work stopped, authorities were called, and the silence that had protected the property for generations collapsed in a single afternoon. Investigators uncovered more than one grave, then more. They were shallow, careless, rushed. Some remains showed signs of trauma. Others told stories of neglect rather than violence. The community responded slowly. Some denied knowing anything. Others insisted it was impossible. A few admitted they had wondered, but never asked. Records were re-examined. Gaps became undeniable. Names appeared in census data only once. Children counted, but never followed. No one could explain where they went. Now the ground had. How many were buried there? No one could say for certain. Who made the decisions? Who enforced the silence? Why were no alarms raised sooner? Why did absence become normal? Some perpetrators were already dead. Others were deemed unfit to stand trial. Justice arrived too late to matter to the victims, and parts of the property remain unexcavated, because even now, no one is sure they want to know everything buried there. There are places in America that exist only because no one asks questions. Homes that stand not because they are innocent, but because they are overlooked. The dead beneath that rural house were not lost to time. They were hidden by choice, by families, by neighbors, by systems that preferred quiet over truth. The ground eventually spoke, but it waited decades to be heard. And somewhere there are still homes standing on silence, waiting for the earth to remember what America chose to forget. After the ground spoke, nothing returned to normal. But before that moment, before the first bone surfaced, there was a longer, quieter story that explained why it took so long for the truth to emerge. It is a story defined not by action, but by absence. For decades, the property existed inside a gap, not fully known, not fully ignored. County records showed ownership transfers, tax payments, minor boundary disputes, nothing else. No emergency calls tied to the address, no official complaints, no investigations. The silence was not accidental, it was maintained. Children associated with the household appeared briefly in public systems. A school enrollment form, a census tally, a handwritten note in a church ledger. Then nothing. No transfer records, no graduation notices, no burial permits. They simply stopped existing on paper. In rural America, absence often goes unchallenged. Distance creates plausible explanations. Families move, illness happens, people drift away. And when questions do arise, they are softened before being spoken aloud. Someone might ask, quietly, what happened to the youngest boy. The answer would be vague. He went to live with relatives. She was sickly. They didn't stay long. The explanations were never detailed enough to examine, but they were sufficient to end conversation. The family did not invite scrutiny. They attended gatherings infrequently. They avoided long conversations. Their presence was minimal but consistent enough to avoid suspicion. That balance mattered. Too much isolation invites curiosity. Too much visibility invites oversight. They stayed in between. The house itself helped. It was not large enough to draw attention, not run down enough to inspire concern. Repairs were made slowly over time, always just enough to suggest maintenance. The porch was reinforced once, then again and again. Each time, the work was explained as structural necessity. No one questioned why the same area required repeated attention. No one asked why the ground beneath it shifted after heavy rain. The land surrounding the house had rules. Certain areas were off limits. Fences were placed where they did not make practical sense. Garden plots appeared, then disappeared. Soil was turned even when nothing was planted. These details were visible, but only if someone was looking closely, and no one was. The family learned over time how little effort silence required. It was not enforced through threats or intimidation directed outward. It relied on predictability. They behaved exactly as expected. They paid bills, they nodded in passing, they declined invitations politely. They never created a moment that demanded attention. Inside the home, however, predictability took on a different shape. Schedules were rigid, movement was controlled, doors were locked not for security, but for order. The children learned early where they were permitted to exist. Rooms were assigned purposes that shifted over time. A storage space became a sleeping area became something else entirely. Light was restricted, sound was discouraged. Fear was not loud, it was methodical. When illness occurred, it was treated as weakness. When injury happened, it was hidden. Outside help was framed as betrayal. And when someone became a liability, too sick, too defiant, too difficult to control, the solution was final. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. Death did not interrupt routine. It was absorbed into it. The earth became part of the household structure, a place where problems were put away. Each burial was shallow but deliberate, timed between weather patterns, hidden beneath planned disturbances, a fence post replacement, a porch repair, a failed garden bed. The land was chosen not at random, it was chosen because it belonged to them. Ownership provided cover, and for years it worked. People aged, memories blurred. Those who might have noticed patterns moved away or passed on. The children who vanished were never old enough to build reputations. They left behind no jobs, no families, no social footprints. Their absence created no echo. By the time the property changed hands, the story was already fragmented. No single person remembered enough to see the whole shape. And when the new owners arrived, they did not inherit the silence, they inherited the consequences of it. The land had been holding its breath for decades. It did not need witnesses anymore. It only needed a reason to be disturbed. And that reason was coming. The disturbance began without intention. It was not driven by suspicion or memory. It came from necessity. The house had aged in quiet ways. Moisture collected beneath the porch. Floorboards softened. Supports sagged just enough to be noticed, but not enough to alarm. A contractor was called. Measurements were taken. Soil was marked with spray paint that washed away after the first rain. The work was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of work that assumes the ground beneath a home is empty. The first cut into the earth was shallow, no deeper than required to check a footing. The shovel did not strike stone. It did not strike wood. It struck resistance that yielded. At first, it was mistaken for refuse, old trash buried during an earlier decade, animal remains. That assumption lasted only seconds. The shape was wrong, too symmetrical, too fragile. Work stopped without instruction. No one spoke for a long moment. The soil was brushed back carefully now, with hands instead of tools. A curve emerged, then another. Bone does not announce itself, it waits to be recognized. The call to authorities was delayed, not out of denial, but out of disbelief. There is a space between discovery and acceptance where the mind searches for alternatives. None held. When law enforcement arrived, they approached the site cautiously, not because it felt dangerous, but because it felt wrong. The porch became a perimeter. Yellow tape fluttered where children once sat during summer heat. Neighbors gathered at a distance, not close enough to see details, close enough to feel implicated. The excavation widened. One set of remains became two, then more. They were not buried together. They were placed individually, at different times. The soil told this story clearly. Each grave disrupted the one before it. Layers of earth compressed, then disturbed again. Time had been stacked here, not erased. Some remains were incomplete, bones missing, fragments displaced by later digging. This was not a single event. It was a practice. As forensic teams worked, patterns began to form. The size of the bones suggested youth, adolescence, children. There were no markers to suggest identity, no clothing preserved enough to indicate era, only the depth, the spacing, the repetition. The house above remained silent. Its windows reflected the activity outside, but revealed nothing of what had occurred within its walls. Inside, investigators noted changes, doors that locked from the outside, rooms without clear purpose, spaces too small to be considered storage. The architecture did not accuse, it implied. Each discovery stripped away another layer of assumption. This was not accidental burial, not emergency disposal. This was intention maintained over years. By the end of the first day, the property was no longer a residence. It was evidence. And still, no one could say who the dead were. Names could not be matched. Dates could not be assigned. The land had preserved the act, but erased the people. As night fell, work was suspended. Lights illuminated the yard where graves had been concealed. The house stood just beyond the glow, unchanged, unresponsive. The silence had broken, but it had not finished speaking. The following days brought methodical work. Investigators moved with precision, mapping each grave. Flags marked shallow depressions in the yard. Measurements were taken. Soil samples analyzed. Each mound told a story the paperwork never had. Each layer whispered timelines that had never been recorded. Inside the house, rooms that had seemed ordinary were examined. Cabinets, closets, corners where light barely reached. Every space hinted at control. Every locked door suggested rules that had been enforced silently. The children who had vanished were beginning to reappear, not as living witnesses, but as shadows traced in bone. Not as names, but as fragments of lives carefully erased. Investigators began piecing together patterns. Small details emerged. A door latch too high for a child to reach. A window covered with heavy fabric, allowing only slits of light. Rooms without furnishings appropriate to human life. These were not casual oversights. They were structural, deliberate. Outside, the graves formed a lattice across the yard, each one spaced to accommodate secrecy, each one placed to avoid notice. It became clear that the property itself had been a tool, a controlled environment. Every decision, where a child slept, where a tool was stored, where soil was shifted, served a single purpose: containment. And as forensic work continued, the true scale began to reveal itself. At least a dozen graves were uncovered in that first week. Evidence suggested there could be many more. Some had been disturbed over time, bones moved by erosion, fragments displaced by prior repairs to the porch. Yet the land retained enough memory to tell the story. Neighbors were interviewed. Accounts were vague, often contradictory. A few admitted noticing children who came and went too quickly, but no one had asked questions that mattered. No one had pressed. The family had not needed to speak to maintain control. They had only needed to exist. Inside the home, Personal items provided more pieces. A small stack of letters, yellowed and brittle, contained strict instructions for children's routines. Not guidance, command. Times to eat, times to sleep, times to remain silent. No hint of compassion, no allowance for error. Rooms that had once seemed mundane now carried weight. Corners where dust had collected revealed footprints that were not recent. Shelves where books had been stacked showed signs of repeated rearrangement. It was a household built not around living, but around containment. And as the pattern emerged, the investigators began to understand the full scope of the silence. This was not a family that had failed. This was a family that had succeeded in erasing lives, in masking deaths, and delaying discovery for decades. The property had become both a shelter and a prison, a home above, a graveyard below. And the earth had waited for someone to finally notice. The yard had become a map. Markers, soil analysis, and skeletal fragments began to suggest not just who had been placed there, but when. Generations of absence were forming a timeline, and with it, the realization that the silence was never natural. It was crafted. Every creak of floorboards, every sealed door, every shifted patch of soil had been part of a system designed to keep the past invisible. And yet, despite decades of planning, the past had finally caught up. The land had spoken. And now the truth could no longer be contained. The first pieces of the family's private world were not discovered in the graves. They were discovered in the corners of the house. A set of journals, brittle and yellowed, tucked behind a false panel in the master bedroom. Not written for outsiders, not for any eyes but the family's own. The words were precise, measured, a record of movement, behavior, and obedience. Times to wake, times to sleep, times to eat, times to speak. Each entry was punctuated with consequences, small at first, then severe. It became apparent that punishment had not been occasional, it had been systematic. Rooms had been repurposed to enforce this system. A storage closet became a space where disobedience was corrected. A pantry where light barely reached became a place of isolation. Even common household items were weaponized. Chairs used to restrict movement, doors reinforced to deny escape, tools placed out of reach to prevent simple acts of independence. It was not chaos, it was architecture. Every modification of the home reinforced control. Every rule in the journals enforced silence. And the children had learned these rules from the moment they could walk. They learned to move quietly, to remain unseen, to anticipate correction before it occurred. The discovery of the journals also revealed ritual. Not ceremonial in any religious sense, but structured. Children were counted, their movements logged, errors were noted, recorded, and responded to. Even death was cataloged, not with mourning or grief, but with notation, dates, times, and the method of disposal. Each entry suggested that the family had accepted mortality as part of its system, a problem to manage, not a life to grieve. Outside, the graves began to reflect these records. Investigators compared spacing and orientation to entries in the journals. Each note of disappearance corresponded with a mound, each minor infraction with a grave nearby. The realization was chilling. These were not accidental deaths, not tragedies arising from neglect alone. They were calculated, methodical. The house itself became part of the punishment. Walls enclosed, doors separated, light and sound were controlled. The family's design was total, a household built to produce compliance and conceal consequence. As for the adults, the journals revealed patterns of control as rigid as the architecture. Schedules were dictated with precision, behavioral codes enforced through repetition, compliance monitored constantly. Visitors were rare, letters from outside were monitored. Any interference from neighbors or officials was subtle, manipulated, or suppressed. The system worked because it was invisible, because silence was maintained both inside and outside the property. Even the land had been incorporated. Every mound, every repaired patch of soil, every sunken garden bed was intentional. Burials were spaced, layered, and obscured. The earth was an accomplice, but only because the family had used it with intent. As forensic teams continued, they began to uncover the scale. Bones stacked in shallow graves suggested generations. Different sizes indicated children born decades apart. Some graves disturbed by later construction confirmed repeated practice. The house had been both home and workshop for concealment. The family's patterns were revealed slowly, as if the house itself had been waiting for investigators to notice. And the most disturbing detail: this was not chaos concealed by incompetence. This was mastery concealed by normalcy. Everything about the home, the land, and the family reflected careful planning, control enforced across decades. And still, the journals revealed only part of the story. Not every entry survived. Not every name could be identified. Some passages were deliberately obscured, erased, or torn. Even in documentation, the family controlled what could be remembered. The silence they had maintained for so long was deliberate. It was cultivated. It was inherited. And now, for the first time, it was breaking. The first scream was not human. It was the sound of soil giving way, of decades of weight and secrecy finally pressing upward. It came when the shovel struck the first bone. A dull, hollow impact, almost imperceptible at first. Then, unmistakable. The contractor froze, hands suspended mid-motion. Nothing in experience prepared anyone for what followed. A smell lingered in the air, earth damp and clay heavy, mixed with the faint metallic tang of old decay. It was subtle, almost impossible to describe, and yet undeniable. The silence that had protected the property for generations shattered in that moment. It did not shout. It whispered through every creak of the porch, every rustle of leaves, every wind-blown fragment of paper forgotten in the yard. Investigators arrived quickly, though the contractor's hands were still trembling. Yellow tape was strung with care, defining a boundary that had already been violated. The first grave was small, almost innocuous. A child, no older than 10. The body carefully pressed into the soil, wrapped perhaps in cloth long since rotted away. The next grave was nearby, and the next. A pattern emerged immediately. Shallow, methodical, placed deliberately to avoid notice, but close enough to centralize control. Inside the house, the investigators found journals open on the floor, as if left deliberately. Records of days, weeks, months, years, detailing behavior, missteps, punishments, and disappearances. The juxtaposition was horrifying. The house had documented its own crimes. The yard had preserved them. Each discovery felt inevitable, yet nothing could have prepared anyone for the scale. Neighbors were drawn by curiosity, by fear, by rumor. but even their presence could not pierce the full reality. Most stayed at a distance, voices hushed, eyes downcast. The land, once patient and still, now demanded attention. Shovels worked slowly, reverently. Each mound exposed was treated as evidence, not spectacle. The investigators moved cautiously, mindful of what had been preserved for decades. Bones were fragile, soil held memory. Even the smallest fragment carried weight. And the more they uncovered, the more the story of the family became clear. This was not negligence, not carelessness, not a tragic series of accidents. It was a system perfected over generations. Every child who disappeared had been accounted for in the journals, in the land, in the carefully measured spacing of graves. Even now, it felt almost alive, as if the property itself were asserting its testimony, insisting that no detail be overlooked. The first day ended with dozens of flags marking depressions, dozens of sets of remains carefully catalogued, dozens of questions lingering in the evening air. The house stood above it all, silent and indifferent. Inside, walls still held echoes of footsteps that had never been retraced. Doors remained locked, rooms remained empty. But the silence had ended. The land had finally spoken. And in its voice, there was no comfort, no apology, no absolution. Only truth. The days after the discovery were quiet, but not peaceful. News traveled slowly through the small town, carried in whispers and half-formed questions. Neighbors stared from a distance, avoiding the house, avoiding each other. Some crossed streets to prevent passing too close. Some lingered in doorways, talking just enough to assure themselves it wasn't true. Denial became the first line of defense. "It couldn't have been that bad," one neighbor said. "They were a strange family, yes, but murder? That's impossible." Another admitted quietly, "I always wondered where those children went, but I never thought." They stopped. No one wanted to finish the sentence. No one wanted to acknowledge the possibility that they had been blind for decades. Officials moved carefully. The property was cordoned off. Excavations continued under forensic oversight. Every flag, every bone, every fragment of soil became a symbol not just of loss, but of collective inattention. Inside the house, the journals had been removed. Pages that had dictated life and death were now evidence, catalogued and photographed. The house itself seemed smaller, diminished, almost humbled by the scrutiny. Yet the physical space remained unchanged. Porches sagged, windows stared blankly, rooms held shadows that investigators could not chase away. The community reacted in layers. Some withdrew completely, avoiding the street where the house sat, avoiding conversation about it entirely. Some argued for erasure, cover the story, move on, pretend the graves never existed. Others could not look away. They tried to remember faces, names, children who had never grown old, ghosts of the past pressing against memory. Funerals were impossible. Graves had no names, no records connected bodies to families beyond what the journals suggested. And the living struggled with guilt they could neither define nor justify. The house remained in legal limbo. The family's descendants were absent, silent, or deceased. Ownership tangled in wills and probate. Yet the land had done its work. It had forced acknowledgement. It forced awareness of every absence, every avoidance, every blind eye. But awareness came too late for the victims. And the scale of what had been lost became more apparent each day. Small cemeteries in town held markers for neighbors and relatives, but the unmarked graves in that yard, children, adolescents, young lives, remained absent from maps, from memory, from history. Even officials admitted, privately, that some of the property would never be fully excavated. Some parts were too fragile, too risky. Some were intentionally left untouched because the ground had already told the story it could, and human intervention could do no more. The aftermath was not just a legal and forensic problem, it was a social fracture. A town that had looked away now looked at itself, its silence, its complicity, its inability to question, a weight too heavy for easy absolution. And yet, life continued. School bells rang, farms were sold, new roads paved, families moved in and out. But the property stood as a reminder, a house above the unacknowledged, a yard that held decades of secrets. And in the shadows, even after the investigation ended, the memory of what had occurred lingered. Not in headlines, not in official records, but in the quiet, where every child who vanished left a gap that would never be filled. The silence had been broken, but the damage could never be undone. Even after months of investigation, some questions remained unanswerable. How many had actually lived in that house? No census, no birth record, no ledger could account for every child, every life that had passed through those walls. Who had made the decisions to take life? Which parent, which guardian, which sibling enforced the system of silence and death? No one could say with certainty. Why had the community failed to see? Was it fear, indifference, or simply the ease of ignoring those who did not fit the expected patterns of life? And the names? So many names had been erased, so many voices silenced. The skeletal remains told part of the story, but they could not tell who had loved, who had hoped, who had feared. Nor could they tell why some children were spared longer than others, why some were placed in certain rooms while others were buried beneath garden beds. Some rooms remained untouched, full of secrets that journals never recorded. Some parts of the yard were still unstable, still holding fragments of lives that may never be uncovered. Even forensic science had its limits. Decades of decay, repeated soil disturbances, and lack of documentation made identification nearly impossible. There would be no names on headstones, no plaques for memory. Legal consequences were similarly incomplete. Many of the adults involved were long deceased. Those alive could not be definitively tied to every act. Some cases were closed for lack of evidence. Others lingered in courts and offices, suspended by uncertainty. And the family's full story remained fragmented. Generations of secrecy had been passed down, layer by layer, like sediment. Some of it might never be uncovered. Some of it might have been deliberately destroyed, erased, or forgotten. Even the land refused to surrender all its truths. Burials in unstable soil, areas left intentionally unexcavated, and disturbances caused by repairs or weather had hidden crucial fragments. Investigators could only reconstruct what was visible, tangible, undeniable. But the invisible history, the whispers, the fear, the obedience enforced for decades, could never be fully measured. The community remained haunted in subtle ways. Neighbors remembered faces they had forgotten. School records were revisited, incomplete lists examined. Parents asked quietly about children they had known only in passing. And yet, much of what had occurred remained inaccessible. Names, motivations, reasoning, and the deeper psychology behind the acts, these would likely remain forever buried. The silence that had protected the family for generations left gaps too large to fill. Even now, decades later, echoes of those lives lingered in the soil, in the walls, and in the memory of anyone who had looked closely enough to notice. Some questions had answers, some could be inferred, but many, too many, would never be resolved. The house kept them, the land kept them, and America, once again, had a story it could not fully tell. There are places in America where silence has weight, where the ground remembers what people refuse to. The house still stands, unchanged in its outward appearance. The porch sags in the same way it always did. Windows stare blankly at the road. Rooms remain empty, echoing with footsteps that no one will ever hear again. The land beneath it holds its secrets tightly. Shallow graves, disturbed soil, and fragments of lives buried in secrecy. Names that never made it to any ledger. Children whose laughter, fear, and tears were never recorded. The community has moved on. Life continues. But a shadow lingers. People remember without wanting to. They see patterns they cannot erase. They wonder about faces that existed once and were gone. The house is no longer just a home. It is a witness, a container of absence, a testament to lives erased and memories denied. Some of the dead will never be known. Some of the questions will never be answered. Some of the practices will remain a mystery, hidden in rooms too fragile to explore, in soil too heavy with the past to disturb. And yet, the land has spoken. It has whispered the story of compliance, control, and concealment. It has revealed the consequences of indifference. It has forced acknowledgement, however incomplete, of what was hidden. But there is no closure here, no justice that can restore life, no reconciliation that can undo the silence, no comfort for the absent, only memory, incomplete and uneven, hovering over the property like a fog that never lifts. America tried to forget. It tried to look away, but the earth remembered. And some places will always hold the truth, no matter how long it is ignored. The house remains, the graves remain, and the silence, once broken, has left a permanent echo. A reminder that some stories are too heavy to be buried entirely. That some nightmares, America's buried nightmares, cannot stay hidden.